There appears to have been a dramatic escalation in the Israeli-Palestinian clashes, with Israel's Defence Force announcing a little over an hour ago that its ground troops were attacking in Gaza. The Israeli Defence Force says more than 150 shells and rockets were fired towards Israel in the past 24 hours, while it continues a barrage of attacks against Hamas targets in Gaza. The Palestinian death toll has now passed 100, while 7 Israelis have died. International calls for de-escalation in the conflict have so far been ignored. And the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has released a statement just in the last hour or so, declaring he had said that Israel would charge a heavy price from Hamas. He said, "We are doing this and we will continue to do so with great force." The last word was not said, and this operation will continue as long as it takes to restore peace and security to the state of Israel. Middle East correspondent Tom Joyner joins us now from Ashdod. That's just north of Gaza in Israel. Tom, what can you tell us about this declaration that ground troops, Israeli ground troops, are now attacking in Gaza?
Well, Joe, the truth is we don't really know a whole lot more than this single tweet that you mentioned before from the Israeli Defence Force's official account. It was tweeted around just over an hour ago, just simply saying IDF air and ground troops are currently attacking in the Gaza Strip. Now, it's not immediately clear what that means. For example, we don't know how many troops, we don't know from where they might have entered, if they have entered, and we certainly don't know what their objective might be. So there's not a whole lot of information so far. The Israeli Defence Force couldn't confirm to me about 20 minutes ago any more information than what was already in that tweet. Now, we've heard from people in the Gaza Strip, in the northern Gaza Strip, that there haven't been necessarily any sightings in the last hour of Israeli troops. What we do know has happened, though, is there has certainly been an escalation in airstrikes over the Gaza Strip. At the same time, a number of rockets have been flying overhead where I am here in Ashdod. As you mentioned, it's just north of the Gaza Strip where we are currently. A number of rockets have been flying overhead a few times today already. In fact, just about 40 minutes ago, just before I spoke to you, Joe, we heard sirens here in Ashdod and saw a number of rockets in the sky. Now, it appears from where I was standing that some of those rockets were intercepted by Israel's air defence system, the Iron Dome. And we had to take cover briefly, although that subsided quickly. As for what's happening currently in Gaza, it's just not clear. Israeli media is mixed on what it's reporting so far. There's a lot of speculation, certainly in part due to the fact that on Thursday we heard from the IDF that combat troops were massing at the edge of the Gaza Strip on the Israeli side. That tanks were also gathering there, and it seemed at that point there was we were on the cusp of an escalation in what has been now entering the 5th day of relentless fighting between Hamas in the Gaza Strip and the Israeli military. But beyond what we know from yesterday's announcement that there was a gathering, a massing of troops there along the Gaza border, and the call-up of thousands of reservists from the Israeli side, we don't know a whole lot more. Now, as you mentioned, it appeared from the statement that Benjamin Netanyahu made not long ago that he was seeming to suggest that he'd come good on threats he'd made against Hamas. Certainly his rhetoric over the last couple of days has been ramping up, suggesting at one point especially that he would increase the ferocity and frequency of airstrikes against Gazans in the Gaza Strip, which so far have killed more than 100 Palestinians.
So, Tom, up until now, what have the elements been of the Israeli assault on Gaza? Has it been confined to airstrikes? Have there been some artillery strikes from within Israel on targets in Gaza as well?
Well, the airstrikes have certainly made up the largest part of what we've seen happen over in the Gaza Strip. They began on Monday evening around the same time that rocket attacks first started happening from Hamas in Gaza. Now, those airstrikes from the Israelis have only increased over the last few days. So far, as I mentioned, the death toll, according to Gazan health officials, stands at over 100 Palestinians, including 17 children. What we know from people in Gaza at the moment is that there's been an enormous amount of damage done on the streets of the Gaza city. Entire streets have been levelled. Multi-storey office blocks have been reduced to rubble. I spoke a little earlier today to a few people in Gaza, including a 22-year-old Palestinian woman who told me that she and her friends were terrified. In fact, a number of conversations that she'd been having with her friends on messaging apps were predominantly very brief and blunt questions, things like, are you still alive? Are you safe? Please make sure you stay away from windows. Please make sure that you stay inside your home. So certainly an extraordinarily serious situation now, and it appears that there may be an escalation on the way.
Yeah, and so Tom, if ground troops, Israeli ground troops, have crossed the border into Gaza, how much does that increase the stakes there?
Extraordinarily, Joe. That would be an extraordinary escalation of what's been happening over the last few days. For people who aren't aware, Gaza is a coastal enclave. It's entirely blocked off from Israel. In fact, Israel controls along the largest part of the Gaza border who enters and who leaves. It's been under a strict blockade by Israel since 2007, meaning that goods and people, as I say, going in and out of the territory are controlled by Israel. So for Israel to send troops into the Gaza Strip would represent an extraordinary escalation. Given the ferocity of the back and forth in the aerial bombardments we've seen between Hamas and Israel, ground troops entering the Gaza Strip would only mean one thing, and that would mean a massive escalation.
And it's always a tense relationship between the Palestinians and the Israelis. How has this, or why has this intensified over the last couple of weeks?
Well, it has really been several weeks now. In fact, the unrest first began in Jerusalem around the start of the holy month of Ramadan. For Muslims, this is a time when typically involving fasting throughout the day. Now, Ramadan ended this morning with Eid al-Fitr beginning today, the festive day after Ramadan. But unrest first began several weeks ago in Jerusalem, in part fueled by a situation unfolding in the neighbourhood of Sheikh Jarrah. Now, Sheikh Jarrah is just north of Jerusalem's historic Old City, and it's a place where a number of Palestinian families have been facing eviction from their homes by Jewish settlers. Now, these Jewish settlers had previously made a claim in an Israeli court, which was successful in that court, arguing that the land on which these Palestinian families had been living was in fact Israeli land that dated back prior to the founding of Israel in 1948. As I say, that Israeli court upheld that claim, and those Palestinian families are now facing eviction from their homes. And around the start of Ramadan, there started to be nightly gatherings after the traditional iftar, which is the evening breaking of the fast for Muslims, in and around the Old City, protesting against these forced expulsions from their homes of Palestinian families. And that has slowly gathered momentum. It's culminated around last weekend when we saw a huge amount of violent confrontations in the Old City, particularly with Israeli police using violent measures against Palestinians, including the use of rubber bullets and tear gas, as well as stun grenades. We saw hundreds of Palestinians injured, as well as more than a dozen Israeli police officers. Now, this all changed on Monday when Hamas made an ultimatum to Israel. Now, Hamas is the Islamist militant group that has controlled the Gaza Strip since 2006. It made an ultimatum to Israel saying essentially, stand down your security forces in Jerusalem's Old City and in Sheikh Jarrah, or essentially face the consequences. At 6 p.m. on Monday, they came good on their threat. And that's when the first volley of rockets came into Israel. Now, just as we're speaking now, Joe, I'm seeing just behind the camera there a number of flashes in the sky. It looks to me on first glance like they might be interceptions from Israel's Iron Dome system. But certainly it would be a simple continuation of what we've seen already today. That is a lot of rocket fire over this part of southern Israel.
Okay, so that's happening right now. And so, Tom, and if you have to run inside to a shelter, do so, when required, but we'll keep talking to you while we can. What's been the level of the clashes between the different populations within Israel? Jews turning on Arabs and Arabs turning and the other way around. And what's been the concern about I know some people have been talking about the possibility of civil war, concerns about civil war.
Joe, just as you've been speaking there, I'm just hearing distant explosions right in front of me behind the camera. I'm seeing more than half a dozen, probably a dozen flashes
feel
in the
free
sky.
for the cameraman to turn the camera around to show that, if you've got a cameraman there.
Yeah, can we turn the camera around here just to show the viewers? We're seeing currently what looks to be like fireworks at first glance, but in fact would appear to be rockets. Now, my guess here, and Joe, I don't have any more information than what we're seeing, is that these are rockets fired. Some of them would be fired from Israel's air defence system known as Iron Dome. It's a sophisticated system that has intercepted the vast majority of rockets fired from Gaza since the start of this escalation on Monday. Essentially, it is able to fire out rockets from the ground in Israel and meet Hamas rockets in the sky to destroy them before they're able to make landfall in Israel. Now, I'm not sure if you may not be able to see what's happening there. We're just returning the camera over to me. I'm still watching what looks to be dozens of flashes in the sky. As I say, not clear what they are or who they're from.
Yeah, and Tom, just to explain for viewers, how far are you from Gaza and what's it been like there in the last couple of days with alarms going off and being sent into shelters?
Well, Joe, I'm in Ashdod, as you said at the start. Ashdod is a port city along the Mediterranean coast of Israel, and it's part of a group of cities and towns in this area, including Ashkelon and Sderot, which typically would bear the brunt of rocket attacks from Gaza fired by Hamas. And that's because purely of the proximity to the Gaza Strip. Where I was earlier today in Sderot, that's the closest town to the Gaza Strip. It's really spitting distance away from the Gaza Strip, as well as Ashkelon, where I was yesterday. It's about 20 kilometres as the crow flies from Ashkelon to downtown Gaza City. Now, to put that in perspective, we're talking maybe the distance that someone might drive to commute from home to work in the morning or to get to university or something like that. It's really close. And so for these towns and cities, they've been really bearing the brunt of rocket attacks. It's been quite frequent over the last few days that I have been down in southern Israel that we've heard sirens go off, and that's an immediate signal for anyone hearing them to get to cover. There are public shelters available in cities and towns like Sderot and Ashkelon, which resemble in some way a public toilet block or a concrete box. It's hard to sort of picture, but they're available for anyone to get inside. Now, for those cities, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Sderot, you really only have 30, 40 seconds from the moment you hear the siren to get into the shelter. So I'll be monitoring carefully for if there is a siren in the next few minutes. But for Israelis who live in this part of the country, it's certainly a normal part of their daily life.
And Tom, just before we leave you, just tell us about some really ugly incidents within Israel over the past couple of weeks with clashes between different ethnic groups.
That's right. Well, Israel is made up of multiple ethnic, religious, cultural groups. It's not, although it's known as the Jewish state, there is a significant population of Arab Israelis. And over the last few days, we've seen confrontations and violent incidents between Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis in towns and cities across the country, most notably in the city of Lod in central Israel. Now, Lod is close to Ben Gurion International Airport. For those who have visited Israel before, they'll know it as the only international airport in Israel. It's near Tel Aviv. Lod has seen the most high-profile violence between Arab and Jewish Israelis in the last few days. Previously, there's been a state of emergency declared there. The authorities have instituted a nighttime curfew. There's been an enormous swell in police presence on the streets, and and violent incidents between Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis, including an incident where a man identified as an Arab was pulled from his car and beaten. But tensions have been very high in cities like that. It's not just in Lod, but elsewhere. And it's really incredible to think that the mood in the country could so dramatically shift in just the last week.
OK, we'll leave it there for the moment. Tom Joyner there on the streets of Ashdod in Israel, just to the north of the Gaza Strip.